Some stories refuse to fade. They stay in the background, in reports, in photos, in unanswered questions. In this video, you'll hear 3 crime stories, each one layered with strange details, broken timelines, and people who disappeared, were silenced, or hid in plain sight. A quiet apartment in London, a highway in the snow, a farmhouse surrounded by woods. These aren't just stories of what happened. They're stories of what we missed and what was never explained. Let's begin. First story, the quiet killer of Muswell Hill. Mike had always prided himself on his nose. Not in the metaphorical sense of sniffing out a good deal or trouble, but literally. Years spent in the plumbing trade had sharpened his olfactory senses to an almost preternatural degree. He could differentiate between the metallic tang of an old copper pipe leak, the musty decay of a long-neglected damp patch, and the unmistakable, cloying sweetness of a blocked sewer line. His nose was his first, most reliable tool, often pinpointing a problem before his eyes or hands could. But the smell in Muswell Hill, particularly emanating from the drains of number 23 Cranley Gardens, was something else entirely. It wasn't the usual putrid stench of sewage, nor the sharp, acrid bite of chemical drain cleaner. This was different. It was a dense, sickly sweet aroma, almost like something organic had been left to rot, but with an underlying, metallic hint that made the back of his throat prickle. It was the kind of smell that clung to the air, seeped into the fabric of your clothes, and burrowed deep into your sinuses, refusing to be dislodged. He'd been called out by the building superintendent, Mr. Bell, a perpetually flustered man whose face seemed permanently etched with the worry lines of 100 tenant complaints. The residents of the top-floor flats had been complaining for weeks. Slow drainage, gurgling pipes, and then the smell. At first, it was subtle, dismissed as a general London drain issue. But over the past few days, it had intensified, becoming an inescapable presence, particularly around the main stack pipe that serviced the upper floors. "It's getting worse, Mike," Bell had fretted, wringing his hands as Mike knelt by the access panel in the communal hallway. "Mrs. Henderson from 24B says it's making her ill. And even Mr. Nilsson, he's usually so quiet, but even he mentioned it." Mike grunted, his head tilted, listening to the faint, sluggish gurgle from within the pipe. Dennis Nilsson, flat 23D. Mike knew the name. He was one of those tenants who blended into the background, a shadow in the periphery. Always polite, always quiet, always alone. A civil servant, Mike thought, or something equally unassuming. He had seen Nilsson occasionally, walking his dog, a scruffy little terrier, or carrying a shopping bag. Nothing remarkable, just another face in the quiet, respectable suburb of Muswell Hill. "Right?" Mike muttered, pulling on his thick rubber gloves. "Let's have a look." He unlatched the access panel, and the smell hit him with a physical force, a wave of sickening sweetness that made him recoil slightly. It was stronger here, almost suffocating. He shone his powerful LED torch into the dark cavity, illuminating a tangle of pipes. The main soil pipe, a thick, cast-iron behemoth, descended through the building, carrying waste from the flats above. He could see a dark, viscous residue clinging to the inside of the pipe, just below where the branch lines from the upper flats connected. It looked like congealed fat, but it was too dark, too dense, and the color was off. Not the greasy yellow-brown of cooking fat, but a deeper, almost reddish brown, like dried blood. "Looks like a serious blockage," Mike said, his voice muffled by the rising nausea. "Something's really gummed up the works in the main stack." He tried to use his drain snake, a long, flexible auger designed to clear stubborn blockages. He fed it down the pipe, feeling for resistance. It snagged almost immediately, not on a solid mass like a rag or a toy, but on something yielding yet resilient. He pushed harder, twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like trying to push through a thick, spongy mass. He pulled the snake back slowly, the metal cable emerging coated in the same dark, reddish-brown slime. And then something else. Small, White, irregular fragments, like tiny pieces of bone or gristle, mixed in with the viscous goo. Mike frowned, his brow furrowed in concentration. This wasn't right. He'd seen every kind of blockage imaginable in his career. Hair, grease, sanitary products, even small animals. But this was unprecedented. The texture, the color, the fragments. It was deeply unsettling. He took a deep breath, trying to clear his head, but the sickly sweet smell persisted. He needed to get a better look, maybe from a higher access point. The complaints were coming from the top floor, suggesting the blockage was somewhere below them, but above the main ground floor connections. "I need to check the flats above, Mr. Bell," Mike said, wiping his gloved hand on his overalls. "See if I can isolate where this is coming from. It's a big one." Mr. Bell nodded, still looking pale. "Right. I'll get you the keys. Start with 24B, then 23D. Mike went to 24B first, Mrs. Henderson's flat. She was an elderly woman, frail and perpetually complaining, but her distress over the smell seemed genuine. Her sink and bath were draining slowly, and the smell was noticeably stronger in her bathroom. He checked her branch line, but it seemed clear. The problem was further down, in the shared main stack. Then he moved to 23D, Dennis Nilsson's flat. He knocked. A moment of silence, then the sound of footsteps. The door opened a crack, revealing Nilsson's face. He was a man of average height, with a receding hairline and a neatly trimmed mustache. His eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, were a pale blue, almost colorless, and strangely flat. He wore a cardigan and looked, as always, utterly unremarkable. "Yes?" Nilsson asked, his voice soft, almost a murmur. "Mike, the plumber, Mr. Nilsson," Mike said, trying to sound professional despite the growing unease. "Mr. Bell sent me. We're investigating the drain blockage. I need to check your bathroom pipes." Nilsson hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes flickering. "Oh, yes, of course. The smell has been rather persistent." He opened the door wider, stepping back to allow Mike entry. The flat was meticulously tidy, almost sterile. Every cushion on the sofa was perfectly plumped, every book on the shelf aligned. There was a faint, cloying scent in the air, masked by a cheap air freshener, but Mike's nose cut through it instantly. It was the same smell, but somehow more concentrated, more intimate here. It was the smell of the drains, but inside the flat. "Bathrooms through here," Nilsson said, gesturing down a short hallway. He didn't follow Mike, but lingered in the living room, hands clasped behind his back, observing. Mike entered the bathroom. It was small, functional, and spotlessly clean. The porcelain gleamed, but the smell was overwhelming here, emanating from the plug hole of the bath. It was so strong it made his eyes water. He knelt, shining his torch into the dark opening of the bath drain. He could see it clearly now. A thick, gelatinous mass, dark and viscous, clinging to the U-bend. It looked like a solidified block of the same reddish-brown sludge he'd seen in the main stack. But this was fresh, still somewhat fluid. And within it, unmistakable now, were larger fragments. Not just gristle, but something fibrous, like matted hair, and other, harder bits that looked suspiciously like bone chips. A cold dread began to coil in Mike's stomach. This wasn't a normal blockage. This wasn't fat or hair or food waste. This was organic, and it was too much, too dense, too wrong. He stood up slowly, his gaze drifting from the bath drain to the rest of the bathroom. The air freshener was doing a poor job of concealing the underlying stench. He noticed a faint, almost imperceptible stain on the linoleum floor near the bath, a slightly darker patch that had been scrubbed vigorously but not entirely removed. He turned, his eyes meeting Nilsson's in the doorway. Nilsson was still standing there, unmoving, his pale blue eyes fixed on Mike, devoid of expression. He wasn't curious, or annoyed, or even particularly concerned. Just watchful. "Mr. Nilsson," Mike said, his voice carefully neutral, "this is a very unusual blockage. It's not just grease. It looks like a lot of organic matter. Could you tell me if anything unusual has been put down the drain recently? Anything at all? Nilsson blinked slowly. Organic matter? He repeated, his voice still soft, almost a whisper. No, nothing. Just the usual. Bathwater, a little soap. I'm very careful. Mike held his gaze. There was something in those eyes, a profound emptiness that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't hostility, or fear, or even surprise. It was an absence. It's a serious problem, Mr. Nilsson, Mike pressed, his voice firming. It's blocking the main building pipe. I'm going to have to report this to the superintendent. And I think we might need to get the water board involved. This isn't a standard plumbing issue. Nilsson's expression remained unchanged, but a subtle tension seemed to enter his shoulders. The water board? He murmured. Is that really necessary? I'm afraid so, Mike said, already turning to leave the bathroom. He felt an urgent need to get out of the flat, out of that smell, out of Nilsson's unervingly blank gaze. This is beyond what I can clear with my equipment. It's a major blockage. As Mike walked back through the living room, he noticed a large, heavy-duty plastic bin in the corner near the kitchen. It had a tight-fitting lid, but even from a distance, he could detect a faint emanation of that same sickly sweet, metallic odor. He tried not to stare, but his instinct screamed at him. He quickly made his excuses, promising to relay the situation to Mr. Bell. Nilsson nodded, still impassive, and closed the door quietly behind him. Out in the fresh, cold London air, Mike took several deep, shuddering breaths. The smell, however, seemed to have permeated his very being. He could still taste it, feel it clinging to his clothes, his hair. He pulled off his gloves, his hands trembling slightly. He had seen bad things in his line of work, but this was different. The sheer volume of the organic matter, the strange fragments, the unsettling silence of Dennis Nilsson, and that pervasive, cloying smell. It wasn't just a blocked drain. It was a secret. And secrets, especially ones that smelled like this, had a way of refusing to stay buried. He walked quickly to the superintendent's office, his mind racing. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just stumbled upon something profoundly wrong. The drains of Cranley Gardens were speaking, and what they were saying was a language of quiet horror. Mike's report to Mr. Bell had been succinct, professional, and devoid of the visceral horror he felt. He simply stated that the blockage was unprecedented, composed of unidentifiable organic matter, and required the immediate attention of the water authority dueling with the building's main sewer line. He didn't mention the bone fragments, the peculiar smell, or Dennis Nilsson's unervingly blank eyes. Not yet. He was a plumber, not a detective, but the knot in his stomach told him this was far beyond his pay grade. The water board arrived the next morning, a team of burly men in high-vis jackets, their equipment clanking as they set up. Mike watched from a distance, ostensibly on another job down the street, but his gaze kept drifting back to Cranley Gardens. He saw them open the manhole cover, saw the grimaces as the smell wafted up, saw them begin to snake their heavy-duty augers into the subterranean labyrinth. Hours later, the call came. It wasn't from Mr. Bell, but from a foreman at the water board, a gruff man named Dave who sounded genuinely shaken. Mike, it's Dave from Thames Water. You were right. It's not what we usually find. His voice was tight, strained. We've pulled out parts. And it's not animal, mate. Not by a long shot. A cold dread, far more profound than any Mike had felt before, washed over him. He felt the blood drain from his face. Parts, he managed, his voice barely a whisper. Human. Looks like. Flesh and bone. And a lot of it. We've called the police. They're on their way now. The line went dead. Mike stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, the world around him blurring. Human. The word echoed in his mind, heavy and sickening. The smell, the fragments, Nilsson's eyes, it all clicked into place with a horrifying, undeniable clarity. He had been so close to it, had breathed it in, had touched the residue of it. Soon, the quiet street of Muswell Hill was alive with the flashing blue lights of police cars. Uniformed officers cordoned off the area around the manhole, and plainclothes detectives, grim-faced, began to arrive. Mike watched from a respectful distance as the scene unfolded, a morbid fascination mixed with a deep sense of violation. He was later interviewed, his account of the unusual blockage and the unidentifiable organic matter now taking on a chilling significance. He recounted the smell, the reddish-brown sludge, the small white fragments. He mentioned his visit to Nilsson's flat, the overwhelming stench in the bathroom, the spotlessly clean but eerily sterile environment. The detectives listened, their expressions growing increasingly grim. It was only a matter of hours before the focus shifted from the sewer to number 23, Cranley Gardens, specifically flat 23D. The police, armed with a search warrant, entered Dennis Nilsson's apartment. Mike wasn't there to witness it, but the news reports, delivered in hushed, horrified tones, painted a picture more grotesque than anything he could have imagined. The quiet man, the civil servant, the neighbor who walked his dog, had been living with a secret so monstrous it defied comprehension. The drains had indeed spoken, and their testimony was a chilling indictment of the ordinary facade that had concealed an unimaginable horror. Mike, the plumber, had merely been the first to listen. The flat at 23D, Cranley Gardens was, to all outward appearances, unremarkable. A ground-floor apartment in a respectable North London building, it offered little to suggest the darkness it contained. From 1978 to 1983, it was Dennis Nilsson's sanctuary, his stage, and his tomb. To his neighbors, he was a quiet, unassuming man. A civil servant in the Department of Employment, he kept to himself, walked his dog, bleeped, and occasionally exchanged polite pleasantries. He was, in essence, invisible. And that invisibility was his greatest weapon. Born in Fraserburgh, Scotland, in 1945, Dennis Andrew Nilsson's early life was marked by a complex relationship with his grandfather, a fisherman who died when Dennis was young, and a strained relationship with his mother. He joined the army at 16, serving as a cook, and later worked as a police officer for a brief period before joining the civil service. He was a man adrift, searching for connection, yet seemingly incapable of forming lasting, meaningful relationships. His homosexuality, at a time when it was still largely stigmatized, added another layer of isolation. He moved into 23D, Cranley Gardens in October 1981, having previously lived at 195 Melrose Avenue, where he had committed his first murders. The move, he later claimed, was due to a change in his employment and a desire for a fresh start. But the darkness, it seemed, moved with him. His daily routine in Cranley Gardens was a picture of mundane normalcy. He would wake, prepare a simple breakfast, and then walk bleep, often exchanging a brief nod or a polite good morning with other dog walkers or neighbors. He would then commute to his office in Denmark Street, returning in the late afternoon. Evenings were spent quietly, watching television, reading, or listening to music. He was a creature of habit, and his habits were designed to be unremarkable. He was known for his meticulous tidiness. His flat was always spotless, almost clinically so. Every cushion on the sofa was perfectly plumped, every book on the shelf aligned. This fastidiousness, which most neighbors would have seen as a positive trait, was in fact a crucial component of his macabre existence. It allowed him to maintain an illusion of order, to hide the chaos and depravity that festered beneath the surface. His neighbors, like Mrs. Henderson in 24B, or the young couple on the floor above, rarely interacted with him beyond a superficial level. He wasn't unfriendly, just distant. He didn't invite people over, didn't participate in communal activities. He was the quiet man in flat 23D, and in a city of millions, anonymity was easy to achieve. Yet, there were signs, subtle and easily dismissed, that in hindsight, screamed of something amiss. One neighbor, a young woman named Julie, occasionally heard strange noises emanating from Nilsson's flat late at night. Not loud noises, but thudding sounds, muffled scraping, and sometimes a faint, metallic clang. She dismissed them as DIY projects, or perhaps Nilsson moving furniture. After all, what else could it be? Another resident, Mr. Smith, who lived on the floor below, sometimes noticed a peculiar smell in the hallway, particularly after Nilsson had been home for a few days without leaving. He thought it was a combination of stale cooking and something else, something vaguely unpleasant, but he put it down to old pipes or the general effluvium of an old building. He never complained directly to Nilsson, nor did he report it to Mr. Bell. It was just a smell. There was also the matter of the bonfires. Nilsson occasionally had small bonfires in his garden, burning what he claimed was garden waste. The smoke was thick, acrid, and had a strange, sweetish smell that lingered in the air. Neighbors found it unpleasant, but bonfires weren't uncommon in suburban gardens. No one thought to question the nature of what was being burned. And then there were the young men. Nilsson was known to frequent gay pubs in the West End, occasionally bringing young men back to his flat. These were often drifters, homeless youths, or men struggling with addiction. They would arrive with Nilsson, sometimes late at night, and then they would simply vanish. No one saw them leave. No one asked questions. In the transient, often anonymous world of London's gay scene, people came and went. Their disappearances were noted by no one but Nilsson himself. The police, when they finally entered flat 23D, were met not with the expected chaos of a murderer's lair, but with an almost unsettling tidiness. The living room was neat, the kitchen spotless. It was the bathroom, however, that held the first, horrifying clues. The bath, Mike had noted, was spotlessly clean, but beneath the plug hole in the U-bend was the source of the initial blockage, a thick, putrid mass of human flesh and bone fragments. As the police began to dismantle the plumbing, they discovered more. The pipes were choked with human remains, painstakingly dismembered and flushed down the toilet, piece by piece. But the drains were not the only repository of Nilsson's victims. In a wardrobe, concealed beneath a pile of neatly folded clothes, they found plastic bags containing more human remains. Limbs, torsos, heads, all carefully wrapped, almost lovingly preserved. The smell in the flat, which Mike had found so overwhelming, was a faint echo of the true stench that now permeated every corner of the apartment as the police uncovered the full extent of the horror. The small garden at the back of the flat, where Nilsson had held his bonfires, yielded further gruesome discoveries. Buried beneath the soil, charred and fragmented, were the remains of more victims. Nilsson had attempted to dispose of the bodies through burning, but the process was incomplete, leaving behind telltale evidence. The sheer scale of the horror was staggering. Nilsson had murdered at least 12 young men, possibly more, between 1978 and 1983. His victims were often vulnerable, easily overlooked, their disappearances unlikely to raise immediate alarm. He would lure them back to his flat, offer them alcohol or food, and then, in a moment of terrifying transformation, he would strangle or drown them. After the murders, Nilsson would engage in a macabre ritual. He would wash and dress the bodies, sometimes keeping them in his flat for weeks, even months, engaging in what he later described as a form of companionship or company. He would talk to them, watch television with them, as if they were still alive. This necrophilic tendency was a disturbing insight into his profound loneliness and twisted psyche. Eventually, the bodies would begin to decompose, and the smell would become unbearable. It was then that Nilsson would dismember them, often in the bath, using knives and saws, before attempting to dispose of the remains. Some were flushed down the toilet, others burned in the garden, and still others were simply stored in his flat, hidden in cupboards or under floorboards. The quiet, unassuming man of flat 23D was, in reality, a monster. His meticulous tidiness was a mask, his silence a shroud. The strange signs his neighbors had ignored, the faint smells, the muffled noises, the vanishing young men, were not anomalies, but fragments of a horrifying truth. The discovery of the blocked drains had merely prized open the lid of a Pandora's box, revealing the unspeakable evil that had festered in plain sight, hidden by the very ordinariness of its perpetrator. The confession, when it came, was delivered in a flat, almost monotonous voice, devoid of emotion, as if Dennis Nilsson were reciting a shopping list rather than detailing a series of horrific murders. He sat in the police interview room, a stark, functional space, opposite Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and Detective Sergeant Stephen McCusker. The air was thick with the unspoken weight of what they had found, what they knew. Yet, Nilsson remained calm, almost detached. "I've disposed of between 15 and 16 bodies," he stated, his voice barely audible, his pale blue eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the detectives. "I've killed them all in my flat. The first few were at Melrose Avenue, the others here at Cranley Gardens." The detectives exchanged a glance. They had suspected a few victims, perhaps 3 or 4. 15 or 16. The number was staggering, almost unbelievable. But Nilsson continued, his voice unwavering, a chilling testament to his methodical memory. He recounted names, dates, methods, a horrifying chronology of death. He spoke of loneliness, of a profound, aching solitude that had plagued him since childhood. His early life, marked by the death of his beloved grandfather and a difficult relationship with his mother, had left him emotionally stunted, craving connection yet terrified of intimacy. He had tried to form relationships, both platonic and romantic, but they had always failed, leaving him feeling rejected and isolated. "I just wanted company," he murmured, almost to himself, as if trying to justify the unimaginable. "Someone to be there, someone to stay." He described the pattern. He would frequent gay pubs in London's West End, seeking out vulnerable young men, often homeless, or struggling with addiction, or simply adrift. He would invite them back to his flat, offering them food, drink, a place to sleep. He would engage them in conversation, sometimes for hours, creating an illusion of companionship, of genuine connection. And then, the moment of transformation. When the victim was asleep, or vulnerable, or simply no longer serving his need for connection, Nilsson would act. He would strangle them, or drown them in the bath. The act itself, he claimed, was often impulsive, a sudden, overwhelming urge to possess, to control, to prevent them from leaving him. It was like a need, he explained, his voice still flat, to keep them, to stop them from going away. After the murder, the ritual would begin. He would wash the bodies, dress them, sometimes even sit them in his favorite armchair, the warm chair, as he chillingly referred to it. He would talk to them, watch television with them, as if they were still alive, still his companions. This necrophilic phase, he confessed, was the closest he came to feeling truly connected, truly at peace. The dead could not leave him. They could not reject him. They were entirely his. "They were my friends," he said, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his voice. "My company. I didn't want to let them go." The detectives listened, a mixture of revulsion and professional detachment warring within them. They had seen many killers, heard many confessions, but Nilsson's calm, almost clinical recounting of such depraved acts was uniquely disturbing. There was no remorse, no outward display of guilt, only a strange, detached introspection. He detailed the dismemberment process with the same chilling precision. When the bodies began to decompose, when the smell became too strong, he would take them to the bathroom. He described using knives, saws, and even a meat cleaver to cut them into manageable pieces. He would then attempt to dispose of the remains, flushing smaller pieces down the toilet, burning larger pieces in bonfires in his garden, or simply storing them in plastic bags, hidden in cupboards or under floorboards. He spoke of the logistical challenges, the constant battle against the smell, the fear of discovery. He described how he would boil heads on the stove to remove the flesh, then crushed the bones with a hammer before flushing them away. The image was so grotesque, so utterly beyond the pale, that even the seasoned detectives struggled to maintain their composure. "It was a lot of work," he said, as if discussing a particularly arduous household chore. "But I had to do it. I couldn't just leave them." His motive, as far as he articulated it, was rooted in a profound and desperate need for control and companionship, twisted by a deep-seated pathology. He didn't kill for sexual gratification in the conventional sense, nor for financial gain. He killed to possess, to keep, to fill the gaping void of his loneliness. The act of murder, for Nilsen, was an extension of his desire for an ultimate, unbreakable bond. The police interview continued for days, Nilsen meticulously detailing each murder, each victim, each method of disposal. He was cooperative, almost eager to tell his story, as if finally, after years of silence, he had found an audience for his darkest secrets. He led them to the locations of other hidden remains, guided them through the labyrinthine details of his crimes. Mike, the plumber, followed the news reports with a growing sense of horror. He saw Nilsen's face on the television, the same blank eyes he had encountered in flat 23D. He heard the details of the confession, the gruesome methods, the sheer number of victims. He thought of the smell, the reddish-brown sludge, the bone fragments he had pulled from the drain. It had been human. All of it. He remembered Nilsen's quiet demeanor, his unassuming presence. The man who walked his dog, the civil servant, the neighbor who kept his flat so meticulously tidy. The ordinariness was the most terrifying aspect of all. Evil, Mike now understood, didn't always announce itself with a flourish. Sometimes it hid in plain sight, in the quietest corners, beneath the most mundane facades. The image of Nilsen sitting calmly in his flat, perhaps with a dead body in his warm chair, watching television, was an image that would haunt Mike for years. The sheer banality of the evil, the way it had coexisted with everyday life, was a chilling testament to the duality of a man who led two lives in silence. One, a quiet, lonely civil servant. The other, a meticulous, methodical killer whose secrets were finally brought to light by a blocked drain and a plumber with a keen nose. The hollow silence that now descended upon Cranley Gardens was not just the absence of noise, but the crushing weight of a terrible revelation. The quiet killer had been among them, and no one had known. The discovery, initiated by Mike's persistent nose and the waterboard's grim confirmation, quickly escalated into a full-scale police operation that gripped London, then the nation. The initial focus remained on the sewer lines around Cranley Gardens. Forensic teams, working in shifts, meticulously sifted through the gruesome contents, each fragment a piece of a horrifying puzzle. The sheer volume of human remains suggested multiple victims, a scale of depravity that shocked even seasoned investigators. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J., a man known for his calm demeanor and sharp intellect, found himself confronting a case unlike any he had encountered. The methodical nature of the dismemberment, the attempts at disposal, and the sheer audacity of the killer to live amidst such horror were truly unsettling. The initial breakthrough, the blocked drain, was a testament to the most mundane of details leading to the most extraordinary of crimes. Mike, the plumber, found himself a reluctant, minor celebrity, his name mentioned in hushed tones in news reports, the man whose ordinary job unearthed an unimaginable evil. He gave his statements, answered questions, and then retreated, trying to process the enormity of what he had inadvertently uncovered. The police investigation, now centered on Nilsen's flat, revealed a chilling tableau. The flat, once a symbol of Nilsen's meticulous control, became a crime scene of unprecedented horror. Every surface was dusted for prints, every crevice searched. The bathroom, in particular, yielded the most damning evidence. Despite Nilsen's attempts at cleanliness, traces of blood, tissue, and bone fragments were found embedded in the grout, beneath the linoleum, and within the very fabric of the bathtub itself. Forensic scientists worked tirelessly, piecing together the grim mosaic of human remains, attempting to identify the victims. The garden, too, was excavated. The soil, disturbed by Nilsson's frequent bonfires, revealed charred bones and teeth, fragments that had resisted complete incineration. Each discovery added to the horrifying tally, confirming Nilsson's chillingly calm confession. The police also found a collection of personal effects belonging to the victims: wallets, identification cards, clothing, meticulously stored, almost like macabre trophies. It was a stark contrast to Nilsson's stated desire for companionship. These were not companions, but possessions, meticulously catalogued remnants of lives he had extinguished. The media frenzy that followed was intense. Headlines screamed of the House of Horrors, the monster of Muswell Hill. Nilsson's face, once anonymous, was plastered across every newspaper, his pale, unremarkable features now imbued with an unsettling notoriety. The quiet man, the civil servant, became the focus of a national nightmare. The public struggled to reconcile the image of the unassuming neighbor with the reality of the serial killer. How could such evil exist in such ordinary surroundings? How could it have gone unnoticed for so long? For Mike, the news reports were a constant, unsettling reminder. He would sit in his living room, the evening paper spread across his lap, reading the latest gruesome details. He'd see the police tape, the forensic tints, the solemn faces of the detectives on the television news, and a cold shiver would run down his spine. He remembered the smell, the sickly sweetness that had clung to him for days. He remembered Nilsson's flat, the almost sterile tidiness that now seemed like a grotesque mockery of order. He thought about Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman from 24B, who had complained about the smell making her ill. He thought about Mr. Bell, the superintendent, whose worry lines had deepened into a permanent furrow of disbelief. The entire building, once a quiet, unremarkable block of flats, was now tainted, a monument to the horrors it had unknowingly harbored. The investigation extended beyond Cranley Gardens, delving into Nilsson's previous residence at Melrose Avenue. There, the scale of his earlier crimes became apparent. More remains were found, buried beneath floorboards, confirming Nilsson's confession that his murderous spree had begun years earlier. The pattern was consistent. Vulnerable young men, lured back to his flat, murdered, and then dismembered and disposed of in the most horrific ways imaginable. The sheer audacity of his methods, the casualness with which he treated human life, was almost incomprehensible. The police worked tirelessly to identify the victims. Many were indeed drifters, runaways, or individuals with no fixed abode, making identification a painstaking process. Appeals were made to the public, photographs of missing young men were circulated, and slowly, agonizingly, names were put to the remains. Each identification brought a fresh wave of grief and horror to families who had long wondered about the fate of their loved ones. The drains, which had initially spoken of a mere blockage, were now screaming the names of the dead. Mike found himself grappling with a profound sense of unease. He had always believed in the tangible, the visible, the things that could be fixed with a wrench and a bit of elbow grease. But this was an intangible evil, a darkness that had hidden in plain sight, beneath the veneer of normalcy. It was a chilling lesson in the deceptive nature of appearances. The quietest people, he realized, could harbor the loudest, most terrifying secrets. He often wondered about the victims. What were their stories? What dreams had they carried? They were not just parts in a sewer, but individuals whose lives had been brutally cut short. He felt a strange, detached responsibility, as if his discovery had given them a voice, a final, horrifying testament to their existence. The drains, once silent conduits of waste, had become unwilling witnesses, their choked passages holding the terrible truths that Nilsson had tried so desperately to conceal. The investigation continued, a grim, methodical unearthing of a quiet killer's monstrous legacy, all stemming from a plumber's call about a persistent, sickening smell. The trial of Dennis Nilsson was a macabre spectacle that captivated the nation. Held at the Old Bailey, London's central criminal court, it laid bare the chilling details of his crimes, transforming the quiet man from Muswell Hill into a figure of horrifying notoriety. Mike, the plumber, did not attend the trial, but he followed the proceedings through the daily newspaper reports and the evening news bulletins. Each new detail confirmed the unspeakable reality he had first glimpsed in the clogged pipes of Cranley Gardens. Nilsen, despite the overwhelming evidence and his own detailed confessions, pleaded not guilty to murder, instead offering pleas of guilty to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility. His defense argued that he suffered from a mental abnormality that substantially impaired his mental responsibility for his actions. They painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual, plagued by loneliness and a distorted sense of reality, who sought companionship in the most perverse and destructive ways. However, the prosecution meticulously presented the evidence, detailing the premeditation, the methodical disposal of bodies, and the chilling lack of remorse in Nilsen's own accounts. They highlighted the calculated nature of his acts, the careful selection of vulnerable victims, and the elaborate efforts to conceal his crimes. The forensic evidence, the testimony of the police officers who had uncovered the horror, and Nilsen's own chillingly calm confessions painted a picture of a man fully aware of his actions, however twisted his motivations. What struck Mike most, as he read the transcripts and summaries, was Nilsen's continued demeanor. Even in the courtroom, facing the full weight of the law and the horrified gaze of the public, Nilsen remained largely impassive. His pale blue eyes, which Mike remembered so vividly, seemed to betray little emotion. He would listen to the gruesome testimony, sometimes interjecting with a quiet correction of a minor detail, as if discussing a factual error rather than a life he had taken. There was no outward sign of regret, no tears, no visible anguish, just that hollow, unsettling silence. The prosecution argued that Nilsen's apparent calm was not a sign of mental illness, but rather a chilling manifestation of his psychopathy. He was a man who had compartmentalized his life so completely that the monstrous acts he committed existed in a separate, detached reality, disconnected from his mundane daily existence. The warm chair, where he sat with his dead victims, became a symbol of this terrifying duality, a domestic setting transformed into a stage for unspeakable acts. The legal proceedings were protracted, a grim dance between psychiatric evaluations and legal arguments. Families of the victims sat in the public gallery, their faces etched with grief and a desperate longing for justice. For them, Nilsen's attempts to claim diminished responsibility were an insult to the memory of their loved ones. They wanted accountability, not excuses. After weeks of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict. Dennis Nilsen was found guilty of 6 counts of murder. His plea of diminished responsibility was rejected. The judge, in sentencing him to life imprisonment, described his crimes as horrific beyond belief and a catalog of depravity. Nilsen was sent to prison, a quiet, unremarkable man disappearing back into the shadows, this time behind bars. For Mike, the verdict brought a strange sense of closure, but no real peace. The case had irrevocably altered his perception of the world. He had always seen London as a city of bustling life, of ordinary people going about their days. Now, he saw the potential for darkness lurking beneath the surface, in the most unassuming places. He looked at his neighbors differently, not with suspicion, but with a newfound awareness of the hidden complexities of human nature. He often thought about the oddness of evil hiding in routine. Nilsen had been a civil servant, a dog owner, a quiet neighbor. He had lived an outwardly normal life, commuting to work, buying groceries, all while committing acts of unimaginable horror. The mundane had become a perfect camouflage. It was a chilling reminder that monsters do not always wear monstrous faces. Sometimes they wear cardigans and wire-rimmed glasses. The smell, too, lingered in his memory. Not just the physical stench, but the metaphorical one. The smell of secrets, of decay, of lives extinguished and carelessly discarded. He found himself more attuned to the subtle anomalies of life, the things that were slightly off, the quiet signs that might otherwise be ignored. His plumber's nose, once just a tool of his trade, had become a sensor for the unseen, the unspoken. Cranley Garden slowly returned to its former quietude, but it was a different kind of quiet now. A hollow silence, heavy with the memory of what had transpired within its walls. The residents who remained lived with the knowledge that a serial killer had walked among them, that the very pipes beneath their feet had borne witness to his crimes. Some moved away, unable to shake the pervasive sense of unease. Others stayed, trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy, but forever marked by the shadow of Nilsson. Mike continued his plumbing work, his hands still capable, his mind still sharp, but the world had shifted on its axis. He saw the drains not just as conduits for waste, but as silent witnesses capable of holding terrible truths. He understood now that evil wasn't always a grand, dramatic spectacle. Sometimes it was quiet, meticulous, and utterly mundane, hiding in the everyday, waiting for a plumber to notice a smell beneath the sink. He reflected on the fragility of human connection, the desperate need for companionship that could twist into something so monstrous. Nilsson's profound loneliness, while never an excuse for his actions, offered a chilling glimpse into the abyss of a mind consumed by isolation. It was a reminder that even in a bustling city, one could be utterly, terrifyingly alone. Years passed. The Nilsson case became a grim chapter in British criminal history, studied by criminologists, dramatized in documentaries, a cautionary tale of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of ordinary life. Mike, the plumber, faded back into his own quiet routine, his role in the discovery largely forgotten by the wider public. But he carried the weight of it, the quiet dread, the indelible mark of having been the first to hear the drains speak. The silence that followed the trial was not one of peace, but of a profound, lingering unease. It was the silence of a secret revealed, a horror laid bare. And in that hollow silence, Mike often found himself reflecting on the thin veil between the ordinary and the monstrous, and how easily it could be pierced by something as simple and as terrifying as a persistent, sickly sweet smell. The quiet killer was gone, but the echo of his silence and the whispers of the drains would forever remain. Story number 2, Gone in the Snow. The disappearance of Maura Murray. The bell above the old oak door of the Haverhill Public Library tinkled softly, a sound Claire had come to associate with the quiet rhythm of her days. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late February 2004, and outside, the New Hampshire winter still held the landscape in its icy grip. Snow lay thick and undisturbed on the branches of the ancient pines, and the air carried the crisp, clean scent of frost. Claire, a retired librarian whose life had settled into a comfortable, predictable pattern of books, tea, and the occasional visit from her niece, was shelving a fresh delivery of historical fiction when the local paper arrived. It wasn't a knock, not exactly. More of a gentle push, the heavy bundle of the Caledonian Record landing with a soft thud on the worn linoleum just inside the entrance. Claire picked it up, her fingers, still nimble from years of handling delicate pages, unwrapping the twine. She rarely read the front page, preferring to dive straight into the obituaries or the community events. But today, a photograph caught her eye. A young woman, perhaps early 20s, with a bright, earnest gaze and a faint, almost shy smile. Her hair was dark, her features open and inviting. The headline, stark against the white of the page, read, "UMass student vanishes after crash." Claire unfolded the paper, her gaze drawn to the accompanying article. Maura Murray, a 21-year-old nursing student from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, had disappeared 5 days prior, on February 9th. Her car, a black Saturn, had been found crashed into a snowbank on Route 112, also known as Wild Ammonoosuc Road, in Woodsville, New Hampshire, just a few miles from Haverhill. Eyewitnesses had seen her, spoken to her, and then she was simply gone. The article was brief, factual. It detailed the time of the accident, the witnesses, the state of the car, locked, with the airbags deployed, but no sign of Maura. It mentioned her background, her athletic prowess as a track star, her academic pursuits. It spoke of a desperate family, a missing persons report, and a nascent police investigation. Claire read it once, then again. The image of the girl, Mora, seemed to imprint itself on her mind. There was something about her eyes, a vulnerability perhaps, or a quiet determination that resonated. But it was the lack of information, the gaping hole in the narrative, that truly snagged Claire's attention. A car crash, witnesses, and then nothing. In the vast, silent wilderness of the New Hampshire winter, a young woman had simply ceased to be. The library, usually a source of comfort and order, suddenly felt too still, too quiet. Claire found herself distracted, her thoughts returning again and again to Mora. She imagined the snowy road, the dark trees, the chilling air. She pictured Mora, alone, perhaps injured, perhaps scared, walking away into the deepening twilight. But where? And why? Over the next few days, the local papers continued to carry updates, though they were sparse. The police had searched the immediate area, brought in tracking dogs, but the heavy snow had swallowed any scent, any trace. The car was impounded. Her family had arrived, frantic and bewildered. The story, instead of clarifying, seemed to grow murkier with each passing day. Claire started keeping a small, leather-bound notebook, one she usually reserved for gardening notes or book recommendations. In it, she began to transcribe every detail she could find about the case. Newspaper clippings, snippets from radio reports, anything that shed a sliver of light on the mystery. She felt a strange, almost maternal pull towards Mora, a desire to understand, to piece together the fragments of a life that had abruptly ended mid-sentence. She learned about Mora's life leading up to the disappearance. The recent car accident in her father's car, the hit-and-run incident involving a fellow student, the alleged fraudulent use of a credit card, the emotional phone call with her sister just hours before she left UMass. Each detail, instead of offering clarity, seemed to add another layer of complexity, another potential motive for an unexplained flight. Was she running from something? Or to something? The online world, still relatively nascent in its true crime obsession, began to buzz with theories. Forums sprang up, dedicated to Maura Murray. Claire, a woman who had only recently mastered email, found herself navigating these digital spaces, reading the endless speculations, the fervent debates, the often wild theories. Some suggested foul play, a passing motorist, a local predator. Others believed she had deliberately vanished, seeking a new life, escaping pressures unknown. The sheer volume of information, often contradictory, was overwhelming, yet Claire felt compelled to sift through it, searching for the elusive truth. She started visiting the crash site. It was a pilgrimage, a quiet ritual she undertook on her days off. The road was still remote, winding through thick forest, with only a few scattered houses. She would stand by the snowbank where the Saturn had been found, the silence profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees. She tried to imagine more there, in the fading light, after the crash. What would she have done? Where would she have gone? The landscape offered no answers, only a vast, indifferent emptiness. The obsession grew. It wasn't a frantic, desperate need for answers, but a melancholic, almost meditative absorption. Maura became a phantom presence in Claire's quiet life, a puzzle that consumed her thoughts. She found herself talking to Maura in her mind, asking questions, offering silent solace. The case was a stark reminder of the fragility of existence, how quickly a life could simply evaporate. Her niece, Sarah, noticed the change. "Aunt Claire, you're always on that computer now, or reading those old papers. What is it about this girl?" Claire would sigh, looking out at the snow-covered hills. "It's the not knowing, Sarah. The way she just vanished. It's like a story without an ending, and I find myself wanting to write it. But there was no ending to write. Only a deepening mystery, a growing sense of unease, and the haunting image of a young woman gone in the snow, leaving behind only questions and the chilling silence of a New Hampshire winter." The knock at the library door, the arrival of that ordinary newspaper, had opened a portal to a world of unresolved mystery, and Claire, the retired librarian, had stepped through it, consumed by the haunting lack of answers. The last known movements of Maura Murray, on February 9, 2004, unfolded with a chilling precision, a timeline that, despite its clarity, only served to deepen the mystery of her disappearance. Claire, poring over police reports, witness statements, and online timelines, reconstructed the day with the meticulousness of a scholar dissecting an ancient text. Every detail, no matter how small, felt significant, a potential key to unlocking the enigma. Maura's day began like any other Monday at UMass Amherst. She attended classes, went to her nursing practicum, but beneath the surface of routine, something was amiss. That morning, she had sent an email to her professors and work supervisor, claiming a family emergency and stating she would be gone for a week. The email was vague, offering no specifics. It was a lie. There was no family emergency. Later that day, she made a series of phone calls. One to a condominium in Bartlett, New Hampshire, a place her family had visited in the past. Another to a former boyfriend. Her last known phone call was to check her voicemail at 4:37 p.m. She packed a bag, including some clothes, toiletries, and textbooks. She withdrew $280 from an ATM, almost all the money she had. She purchased alcohol, a box of Franzia wine, Kahlua, and Bailey's Irish Cream. She returned library books. She seemed to be preparing for a trip, a getaway. But where? And why the secrecy? At approximately 3:30 p.m., Maura left the UMass campus in her black 1996 Saturn. She was seen on security footage, alone in the car. Her destination, ostensibly, was New Hampshire. But the route she took, through rural backroads, seemed circuitous, almost evasive. She drove north, eventually turning onto Route 112, a winding, two-lane highway that cut through the White Mountains, a road often treacherous in winter. The first sighting of Maura in New Hampshire came from a local bus driver, Butch Atwood, who lived near the crash site. At around 7:27 p.m., Atwood saw Maura's Saturn crashed into a snowbank on the northbound side of Route 112, near the intersection of Bradley Hill Road. The car was facing east, its front end wedged deep into the snow, the airbags deployed. Atwood pulled over, offering assistance. He later told police that Maura, though appearing shaken, refused help. She told him she had already called AAA. This was another lie. Her cell phone had no service in that remote area, and there was no record of any such call. Atwood, seeing no immediate danger, continued on his bus route, promising to call the police once he got home, as there was no cell service at the crash site. A few minutes later, around 7:37 p.m., another local resident, a couple driving home, came upon the scene. They saw Maura standing outside her car. They also offered help. Maura again declined, saying she had already called AAA and that she was fine. The couple, like Atwood, continued on their way, noting the crash but not sensing any immediate emergency. Then came the final, most haunting sighting. A third witness, a student named Fred Murray, no relation, who was driving behind the couple, saw a young woman standing by the crashed Saturn. He later described her as appearing cold and disoriented. He did not stop, assuming the couple ahead had offered assistance. This was the last confirmed sighting of Maura Murray. When the police arrived at the crash site approximately 10 minutes later, at 7:46 p.m., the scene was eerily silent. The Saturn was there, still wedged in the snowbank, its airbags deployed. The driver's side door was locked. The passenger side door was also locked. The windshield was cracked. Inside, a box of wine was on the back seat, along with a few other items. But Maura was gone. There were no footprints leading away from the car, not in the fresh snow that had fallen earlier that day. No signs of a struggle. No blood other than a small stain inside the car, consistent with a minor injury from the airbag deployment. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, absorbed by the vast, silent, snow-covered landscape. The immediate area was searched. Dogs were brought in, but the scent trail quickly vanished, lost in the cold, or perhaps carried away by the wind. The police initially treated it as a simple missing person case, assuming she had wandered off, perhaps disoriented or injured, or had been picked up by a passing motorist. But as the hours stretched into days, and the days into weeks, the lack of any trace became increasingly unsettling. Claire imagined the scene with vivid clarity. The narrow road, hemmed in by towering trees. The pristine white blanket of snow, disturbed only by the crumpled black Saturn. The fading light, the encroaching darkness. Maura, a young woman, alone, perhaps shivering, her breath misting in the frigid air. Did she feel fear? Did she feel regret? Was she making a choice, or was a choice being made for her? The details of the car's interior were also puzzling. A rag was stuffed into the tailpipe, a common trick to disable a car, but also a potential sign of someone trying to create a breakdown scenario. The keys were gone. Her cell phone, credit cards, and debit cards were also missing. Her laptop was in the car, but her backpack, containing her textbooks and other personal items, was gone. It suggested she had taken something with her, something she deemed essential. The weather that night was bitterly cold, temperatures dropping well below freezing. Survival in the wilderness, even for a short time, would have been challenging without proper gear. Maura was reportedly wearing a dark coat, jeans, and sneakers. Not ideal for a trek through snowy woods. The lack of any definitive answers, the frustrating contradictions in her actions leading up to the crash, and the eerie absence of any physical trace, made the case a haunting enigma. Claire felt the melancholic weight of it, the profound sadness of a life that had simply ceased to be, leaving behind only a crumpled car, a few confused witnesses, and the chilling silence of the New Hampshire snow. The girl in the snow had become a ghost, a whisper in the wind, forever lost in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The initial police response to Maura Murray's disappearance was, by many accounts, hampered by a series of missteps and assumptions. Treating it as a simple missing person case, perhaps a runaway or a disoriented accident victim, valuable early hours were lost. As Claire delved deeper into the public record and the burgeoning online discussions, she found a frustrating narrative of missed opportunities and lingering questions. The first major hurdle was the weather. The heavy snow that fell on February 9th and in the days immediately following the crash effectively erased any footprints or scent trails that tracking dogs might have followed. The pristine white blanket, so beautiful to look at, became a cruel accomplice to the vanishing, swallowing up any physical evidence. Search efforts, though extensive, were often hampered by the challenging terrain and the unforgiving winter conditions. Volunteers, family members, and eventually official search and rescue teams scoured the woods, but found nothing. No discarded clothing, no signs of a camp, no trace of Maura. Local theories quickly began to circulate, fueled by the small-town rumor mill and the growing online fascination. One prominent theory was that Maura, disoriented or perhaps under the influence of alcohol, given the purchases she made, had wandered off into the woods and succumbed to the elements. The lack of proper winter gear supported this, but the absence of a body, despite extensive searches, made this theory difficult to definitively prove or disprove. The vastness of the White Mountains, however, meant a body could remain undiscovered for years, even decades. Another theory, popular among the online sleuths, was that she had been picked up by a passing motorist. The stretch of Route 112 where she crashed was remote, but not entirely deserted. A Good Samaritan could have offered a ride, or, more sinisterly, a predator could have seized an opportunity. The fact that she refused help from the bus driver and the couple, yet seemingly vanished shortly after, lent credence to the idea that she might have accepted a ride from someone else, someone she perhaps knew, or someone who appeared less threatening. However, no such motorist ever came forward, and no credible leads emerged to support this. Then there were the strange contradictions that deepened the mystery. Why did Maura lie about calling AAA? Why did she lie about a family emergency? What was the true purpose of her trip to New Hampshire? Was it a spontaneous getaway, a planned escape, or something else entirely? The fact that she had packed a bag and withdrawn almost all her money suggested a deliberate plan, yet her actions at the crash site seemed confused and contradictory. The rag in the tailpipe of her car was another perplexing detail. Was it a deliberate attempt to disable the vehicle, perhaps to stage a breakdown and elicit sympathy or a ride? Or was it a desperate, ill-conceived attempt to fix a mechanical problem? The car itself, though crashed, was not severely damaged. It was drivable, albeit with deployed airbags. This suggested that her decision to leave the scene was not solely driven by the car's condition. The role of her family and friends also came under scrutiny, as is common in missing person cases. While her family was clearly distraught and desperate for answers, the initial lack of full disclosure about Moore's recent troubles, the hit and run, the credit card incident, the emotional phone call, led to some public speculation and frustration among investigators. This was later clarified by the family, but the early opaqueness contributed to the swirling theories. The online community, a burgeoning force in true crime at the time, became both a blessing and a curse. Thousands of armchair detectives descended upon the case, dissecting every detail, proposing elaborate theories, and often clashing with each other. While their collective efforts did unearth some previously overlooked information and keep the case in the public eye, they also generated a significant amount of misinformation, wild speculation, and harassment of individuals tangentially connected to the case. Claire found herself navigating this chaotic landscape, trying to discern credible leads from baseless conjecture. One of the most persistent and unsettling aspects was the sheer lack of physical evidence. No body, no significant personal belongings found, no clear path of escape. It was as if Maura had simply dematerialized. The vastness of the New Hampshire wilderness, with its dense forests, rugged terrain, and countless abandoned logging roads, offered endless possibilities for concealment. But the complete absence of any trace, despite years of dedicated searching by volunteers and law enforcement, was truly baffling. Claire often reflected on the human tendency to seek patterns, to impose order on chaos. In Maura's case, there was no clear pattern, only a series of disjointed events that refused to coalesce into a coherent narrative. The more she learned, the less she seemed to understand. Each new piece of information, instead of providing an answer, seemed to spawn 3 new questions. The case became a symbol of the elusive nature of truth, a testament to how quickly a person could vanish without a trace, leaving behind only a trail of breadcrumbs that led nowhere. The local theories, the failed searches, the strange contradictions, all contributed to the enduring enigma of Maura Murray. There were no footprints in the snow, and no answers in the silence. Only the chilling realization that sometimes people simply disappear, leaving behind a void that can never be filled. The question hung in the air like the lingering scent of pine needles after a winter storm. What if she ran? This was the theory that Claire found herself returning to most often, not because it offered a definitive answer, but because it resonated with the deeper, more melancholic understanding of human vulnerability and the desperate need for escape. It was a meditative exploration, a quiet contemplation of the forces that might drive a young woman to shed her life and disappear into the unknown. Maura Murray's life, while seemingly promising on the surface, a nursing student, a talented athlete, was not without its pressures and complexities. Claire had pieced together a mosaic of recent events that suggested a young woman under considerable strain. The car accident in her father's vehicle, the hit and run, the credit card fraud allegations, the emotional phone call with her sister, these were not isolated incidents but a cluster of events that could weigh heavily on a young mind. What if the weight became too much? What if the accumulation of these pressures, combined with the inherent anxieties of young adulthood, led her to a breaking point? The idea of simply vanishing, of escaping the consequences and expectations, could be a powerful siren call. To shed one's identity, to start anew, to simply not be the person everyone expected her to be. It was a fantasy many might entertain, but few would ever act upon. Claire imagined Maura sitting in her dorm room, staring at the packed bag, the withdrawn cash, the purchased alcohol. Was it a carefully planned escape, meticulously orchestrated to leave no trace? Or was it a desperate, impulsive flight, born of a sudden, overwhelming need for freedom? The email to her professors, the lies about a family emergency, these suggested a degree of premeditation, a desire to buy herself time, to create a buffer between her old life and whatever lay ahead. The choice of New Hampshire, a state known for its vast, untamed wilderness and its live free or die ethos, seemed significant. It offered anonymity, a place where one could disappear into the landscape, become just another face in a small town, or perhaps even live off the grid. The winding, remote roads, the thick forests, the sparse population, it was an ideal backdrop for a vanishing act. But if she ran, where did she go? And how did she manage to disappear so completely? This was the crux of the enigma. If she intended to vanish, she would have needed help, or at least a safe haven. Did she have a secret confidant, a hidden destination? The phone call to the New Hampshire condominium suggested a potential prearranged meeting, a place she might have intended to stay. But if so, why did no one ever come forward? The idea of a ghost life intrigued Claire. Could Maura be living under a new identity, working a quiet job, far from the pressures of her past? It was a romantic notion, but also a terrifying one. To sever all ties, to abandon family and friends, to live in perpetual secrecy, what kind of person could endure such an existence? And what kind of person would choose it? Claire considered the possibility of a mental health crisis. The pressures Maura faced could have triggered a breakdown, leading her to make irrational decisions, to wander off disoriented, or to seek solace in isolation. If she was suffering from depression or anxiety, the act of disappearing might not have been a calculated escape, but a desperate cry for help or a retreat from a world that felt overwhelming. In this scenario, her survival in the harsh winter conditions would have been unlikely, yet the absence of a body still remained. The online discussions about this theory were often passionate, divided between those who believed she was a victim of foul play and those who clung to the idea of a deliberate disappearance. Some argued that her athletic background and intelligence made her capable of surviving in the wilderness, or of orchestrating a complex vanishing act. Others argued that her emotional state and lack of wilderness experience made such a scenario improbable. Claire, in her meditative exploration, found herself leaning towards the idea of a confluence of factors. Perhaps it began as a planned escape, a desire for a temporary reprieve, but then something unforeseen happened at the crash site. Did she encounter someone who offered a ride, and that ride turned sinister? Did she wander off, disoriented by the crash or by alcohol, and become lost in the unforgiving wilderness? The what if she ran theory didn't necessarily exclude foul play or accidental death. It simply provided a starting point, a potential initial intention. The melancholic tone of the case, for Claire, came from this profound uncertainty. The human mind craves closure, a definitive answer to a mystery. But Maura Murray's disappearance offered none. It was a story left unfinished, a life suspended in a perpetual state of what if. The possibility that she chose to disappear, that she is out there somewhere, living a quiet, anonymous life, was as haunting as the thought of a more tragic end. It spoke to the limits of logic, the unpredictable nature of human choice, and the enduring power of secrets. Claire often sat by her window, watching the snow fall, imagining Maura, somewhere, perhaps looking at the same snow, or perhaps long since swallowed by it. The thought of a deliberate disappearance, a self-imposed exile, was a testament to the profound human capacity for reinvention or for self-destruction. The question, what if she ran, was not just about Maura, but about the universal human desire to escape, to be free, even if that freedom came at the cost of one's entire past. It was a haunting possibility, wrapped in fog and possibility, forever echoing in the quiet corners of Claire's mind. The years that followed Maura Murray's disappearance did not bring answers, but rather a deepening of the mystery, a solidification of the open ending that had so captivated Claire. The case became a touchstone for the nascent online true crime community, a perpetual cold case that refused to fade into obscurity. For Claire, it evolved from an intellectual obsession into a profound meditation on the limits of logic, the weight of memory, and the elusive possibility of peace without closure. The official investigation, though never formally closed, gradually wound down. Leads dried up. New technologies offered faint glimmers of hope. Advancements in DNA analysis, improved satellite imagery, but none yielded the definitive breakthrough needed. The New Hampshire State Police maintained a quiet vigilance, periodically issuing statements, reiterating their commitment to finding Maura, but the trail had grown cold, buried under layers of time and unanswered questions. The online obsession, however, only intensified. Websites dedicated to Maura's case proliferated, becoming vast archives of theories, timelines, maps, and discussions. Reddit threads stretched for thousands of comments, each new detail, no matter how minor, dissected and debated. Claire, now more adept at navigating the digital landscape, found herself a quiet observer in these forums. She rarely posted, preferring to absorb the collective intelligence, the passionate arguments, and the occasional flashes of genuine insight. She noticed the patterns in the online community. The initial surge of empathy and concern would often give way to frustration, then to infighting and accusations. Armchair detectives, convinced they held the key, would clash with each other, with law enforcement, and sometimes even with Maura's family. The human need for an answer, for a neat resolution, was so powerful that it often led to desperate, even harmful, speculation. Claire, however, resisted this urge for a definitive conclusion. She had come to accept that some stories simply do not have tidy endings. Maura's disappearance was not a puzzle with a single, correct solution, but a complex tapestry of human behavior, environmental factors, and sheer, inexplicable chance. The beauty and the tragedy lay in its very ambiguity. She continued her quiet pilgrimages to the crash site. The seasons cycled through, the stark white of winter giving way to the vibrant green of spring, the lushness of summer, and the fiery hues of autumn. Each visit offered a different perspective, a new layer to the landscape that had swallowed Maura. She would stand by the side of Route 112, listening to the wind, feeling the vastness of the woods, and contemplating the sheer scale of the unknown. She thought about the weight of memory. For Maura's family and close friends, her memory was a constant ache, a gaping wound that refused to heal. For the online community, she was a symbol, a case study, a fascination. For Claire, she was a quiet companion, a reminder of the mysteries that lie just beneath the surface of everyday life. Maura was not forgotten, but her memory existed in a liminal space, neither fully present nor completely absent. The possibility of peace without closure was a concept Claire had grappled with for years, long before Maura's case. As a librarian, she had seen countless stories, some with happy endings, some with tragic ones, but all with a final page. Maura's story had no final page. It was a narrative that simply stopped mid-sentence, leaving the reader to imagine the rest. Claire realized that true peace, in such cases, might not come from finding the answer, but from accepting the lack of one. It was about making peace with the unknown, with the inherent uncertainties of life. She often reflected on the human need for control, for understanding. We want to believe that every problem has a solution, every mystery a key. But Maura's case defied this. It was a stark reminder that sometimes life simply presents us with unanswerable questions, with voids that cannot be filled. And in those voids, we are forced to confront the limits of our own logic, the boundaries of our comprehension. The meditative quality of her obsession allowed Claire to process these profound questions. She wasn't seeking to solve the case anymore, but to understand the nature of the unsolved. She saw Mora not just as a missing person, but as a metaphor for all the things in life that remain elusive, all the questions that linger without resolution. The case of Mora Murray became a quiet, constant hum in the background of her life. It was a melancholic melody played on the strings of uncertainty and longing. The girl in the snow, gone without a trace, became a symbol of the enduring power of mystery, a testament to the fact that some stories are meant to remain open-ended, forever inviting contemplation, forever resisting a definitive conclusion. Claire, the retired librarian, continued to tend her garden, to organize her books, to sip her tea. But her world was subtly different now. It held a deeper appreciation for the quiet moments, for the fleeting nature of existence, and for the profound beauty of stories that, like Mora's, simply flowed gently into the fog of possibility, leaving behind only the weight of memory and the haunting possibility of peace without closure. The snow would melt and fall again, the seasons would turn, but the question of Mora Murray would remain, an open ending in the vast, silent landscape of the White Mountains. Story number 3, The Silent Witness, the Hinterkaifeck Murders. The path to Hinterkaifeck was never an easy one, not even on the brightest Bavarian summer day. In the early spring of 1922, as the last stubborn remnants of winter snow clung to the shadowed hollows, it was a pilgrimage. For me, Hans, the village postman, it was simply part of my daily rounds, a familiar stretch of muddy track and frosted field that led to the isolated farmstead. But in the days leading up to that unspeakable discovery, the walk felt different. Heavier, quieter. I was a young man then, barely 25, with sturdy legs accustomed to the miles and a mind still largely unburdened by the world's darker truths. My route took me through the small, unassuming village of Kaifeck, nestled amongst rolling hills and dense forests, then out into the open, where the wind had a sharper bite and the silence was profound. Hinterkaifeck, literally meaning behind Kaifeck, lived up to its name. It was set back from the main road, hidden from casual view by a copse of trees and a slight rise in the land. A world unto itself, a world that kept its secrets close. The Gruber farm was a collection of sturdy, dark-timbered buildings, the main farmhouse, a barn, a stable, and a small shed. It was a prosperous farm, by local standards, but its prosperity was overshadowed by a pervasive sense of unease. Even from a distance, one could feel it, a subtle wrongness that clung to the air like the damp morning mist. Old Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was a hard man, known for his stern demeanor and his miserly ways. His wife, Kazilia, was equally formidable, her face perpetually etched with a grim resignation. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, lived with them, along with her 2 young children, Kazilia, aged 7, and Joseph, just 2. And then there was Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, who had arrived only hours before. Well, before everything. My routine was simple. I'd deliver the mail, exchange a few brief words, perhaps a nod, and then continue on my way. The Grubers weren't much for conversation. They were a family of few words, and those words were often laced with bitterness or suspicion. But in the last week of March, the silence from Hinterkaifeck became more pronounced. It wasn't just the usual reticence. It was an absence. On the morning of March 31st, 1922, the air was particularly still. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and a thin layer of frost still coated the fields, sparkling faintly in the nascent sunlight. As I walked, the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the frozen earth and the distant caw of a crow. But as I neared the farm, an unnatural quiet descended. The usual sounds of a working farm, the lowing of cattle, the clucking of chickens, the distant thud of an axe chopping wood, were absent. I told myself it was nothing. Perhaps they were all in the fields, or perhaps they had gone to market. Yet, a prickle of unease started at the back of my neck. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes a storm, or follows a disaster. I reached the farmhouse. The front door was closed, which wasn't unusual. But the windows were dark, the curtains drawn. No smoke curled from the chimney, though the morning was still cold enough to warrant a fire. The stable door was ajar, flapping slightly in the faint breeze, a detail that struck me as odd. Andreas Gruber was meticulous about securing his property. I knocked on the heavy wooden door, my knuckles rapping loudly in the stillness. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, calling out, "Herr Gruber? Frau Gruber? Post." Silence. Only the faint creak of the stable door. I walked around to the side of the house, peering into the windows, but the drawn curtains revealed nothing. The barn door was also slightly ajar. A sense of foreboding began to settle over me, a cold, creeping dread that had nothing to do with the morning chill. I remembered the strange stories that had been circulating in the village for weeks. Whispers of odd occurrences at Hinterkaifeck. Footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the house, but none leading away. Keys gone missing. Noises in the attic. A newspaper found on the property that no one had bought. These were dismissed as village gossip, superstitious tales spun by idle minds. But now, standing in the unnatural silence of the farm, they took on a sinister resonance. I tried the back door. It was unlocked. My hand hovered over the latch, a strange reluctance holding me back. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to walk away, to pretend I hadn't noticed anything. But the postman's duty, the ingrained habit of delivering the mail, propelled me forward. And a deeper, more primal curiosity, a terrible fascination with the unknown. I pushed the door open slowly, a faint groan of old wood breaking the silence. The air inside was cold, stagnant, and carried a faint, sweet smell, not unlike the smell of a forgotten cellar, but with an underlying metallic tang, like old blood. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but my nose, trained by years of detecting the subtle nuances of decay, registered it. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive quiet. "Anyone home?" No response, only the hollow echo of my own voice. I stepped inside, my boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. The kitchen was tidy, but cold. A half-eaten loaf of bread sat on the table, a cup with dried coffee dregs beside it. It was as if life had simply paused mid-breath. But the coldness, the stillness, suggested something far more permanent. My gaze fell upon a small, wooden stool near the hearth. On it, neatly folded, was a shawl, and beside it, a child's toy, a small, carved wooden horse. The sight of these familiar, innocent objects in such an unnaturally silent setting sent a fresh wave of unease through me. I moved through the house, each step a conscious effort. The parlor, the bedrooms, all empty, all silent. The silence was not peaceful. It was a hungry, waiting silence, a silence that seemed to swallow sound. Then, I noticed the stable door, leading from the house to the barn. It was ajar, and from within the barn, a faint, rhythmic sound. Not a human sound. A low, soft chewing. The cattle, they were still there. They had been fed. This detail, more than anything, struck me as profoundly wrong. If the family had simply left, the animals would have been neglected. But they had been fed. Someone had been here. Someone was still here. A cold, creeping dread tightened its grip on my chest. The stories, the silence, the wrongness, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying realization. Something terrible had happened at Hinterkaifeck. And I, the unassuming postman, was about to walk into it. My long walk to Hinterkaifeck had led me not to a delivery, but to the precipice of a nightmare. The silence was about to be broken, not by human voices, but by the chilling truth of what lay hidden within the farm's shadowed confines. The Gruber family was not well liked in the village of Kaifeck. This was no secret. Their lives, played out on that isolated farmstead, were a bitter tapestry woven with suspicion, greed, and a pervasive sense of ill will. As I, Hans, the postman, often observed, their isolation was not merely geographical, it was self-imposed, a fortress built of grudges and dark secrets. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was a man carved from granite. His face, perpetually set in a scowl, rarely softened. He was known for his harshness, his quick temper, and his insatiable desire for land and money. He had a reputation for being difficult, litigious, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. His relationship with his wife, Kazilia, was one of strained endurance rather than affection. She was as stern and unyielding as he, her eyes holding a perpetual weariness that spoke of a life of hardship and unspoken burdens. Their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, was a widow, her husband having died in the Great War. She lived with her parents, along with her two young children, 7-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Joseph. Victoria, though younger, seemed to carry the same grim resignation as her mother. There were whispers in the village about her relationship with her father, dark rumors that no one dared speak aloud, but which hung in the air like a foul odor. It was said that Andreas had fathered Joseph, his own grandson, a scandalous accusation that, if true, would explain much of the family's insular nature and the villagers' quiet disdain. The children, young Kazilia and Joseph, were the only glimmers of innocence on the farm. Kazilia, a bright-eyed girl, would sometimes wave to me as I approached, a rare smile breaking through the family's usual gloom. Joseph, a toddler, was too young to understand the dark currents that swirled around him. Their presence made the farm's atmosphere even more unsettling, a fragile light in a deepening shadow. The Grubers had a history of strained relationships, not just with the villagers, but with their own hired help. Maids rarely lasted long at Hinterkaifeck. The work was hard, the pay meager, and the atmosphere oppressive. The previous maid had left abruptly just 6 months prior, claiming the farm was haunted, that she heard strange noises in the attic and saw shadows moving in the barn. Her stories were dismissed as superstition, but they added to the farm's growing reputation for strangeness. Then, in the weeks leading up to the murders, the strange happenings escalated. These weren't just whispers anymore. They were tangible events, unsettling anomalies that even the most skeptical villagers couldn't entirely dismiss. The first incident involved a set of keys. Andreas Gruber, a man who guarded his possessions with a fierce possessiveness, reported that the house keys had gone missing. He searched everywhere, accusing everyone, but they were nowhere to be found. A few days later, they reappeared, hanging on a hook near the kitchen door, as if they had never left. Andreas, baffled and enraged, dismissed it as a prank, but the incident left him deeply unnerved. Then came the footprints. Days before the murders, a fresh snowfall blanketed the region. The next morning, Andreas discovered footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the forest through the farmyard and directly to the back door of the farmhouse. But there were no footprints leading away. It was as if someone had simply materialized at the house and then vanished into thin air. Andreas, convinced someone was spying on him, spent days scouring the surrounding woods, even checking the attic, but found nothing. He spoke of it with a mixture of fear and fury, convinced he was being targeted. The noises in the attic were another recurring phenomenon. The previous maid had complained of them, and now the family themselves heard them. Footsteps above their heads, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of straw. They would investigate, but find nothing. Andreas, armed with a rifle, would search the attic, convinced it was an intruder, but the space would be empty, silent. Yet, the noises would return, always at night, always when the family was asleep. It was as if an unseen guest had taken up residence in their home, a silent, watchful presence. A few days before the murders, a newspaper was found on the farm. It was a newspaper from Munich, a city far from their rural village. No one in the family subscribed to it, nor had anyone visited Munich recently. It was simply there, lying on the ground, a baffling anomaly. Andreas, his paranoia growing, believed it was another sign of an unseen presence, a deliberate taunt. The most chilling incident, however, involved the family dog. The dog, usually a vigilant guard, was found barking furiously at the stable door one night, its hackles raised, its body trembling. Andreas went to investigate, but saw nothing. The dog, however, continued to behave strangely for days, whimpering and refusing to enter certain parts of the farm. These strange occurrences, dismissed by some as superstition, by others as the eccentricities of a reclusive family, were, in hindsight, clear warnings. They were straws in the wind, whispers of an encroaching darkness that the Grubers, trapped in their own bitter world, failed to heed. They were signs that someone had indeed entered their isolated world, someone who was not a prankster, nor a ghost, but a flesh and blood presence, silently observing, waiting. The villagers, though aware of the strange happenings, did not intervene. The Grubers were too difficult, too private. No one wanted to get involved in their affairs. It was a common sentiment in rural communities, a reluctance to meddle, a respect for boundaries, even when those boundaries seemed to conceal something deeply unsettling. This collective inaction, born of indifference and a fear of confrontation, would later haunt the entire community. As I, Hans, walked my route, delivering the mail, I heard these stories, piecing them together like fragments of a broken mirror. I felt the unease, the subtle wrongness that emanated from Hinterkaifeck. But like everyone else, I dismissed them, or at least, I didn't act. I was just the postman, after all. What could I do? The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived on the afternoon of March 31st. She was a young woman, eager for work, unaware of the sinister undercurrents that permeated the farm. She had barely settled in, barely had time to unpack her meager belongings before the silence descended. Her arrival, a fleeting moment of new life, was tragically timed, a final, innocent addition to a tableau of impending doom. The straw in the wind had become a gale, unseen but felt, a chilling premonition of the storm that was about to break over Hinterkaifeck. The family, isolated by their own nature and the villagers' indifference, stood on the precipice, unaware that the unseen guest had finally decided to reveal itself, not as a shadow, but as a silent, brutal force. The true horror of Hinterkaifeck was not just the murders themselves, but the chilling prelude, the period when an unseen guest, a silent predator, had already infiltrated the Gruber family's isolated world. As I, Hans, pieced together the fragmented accounts after the fact, the meticulousness of the killer's infiltration became terrifyingly clear. It was a slow, deliberate tightening of the noose, a psychological torment that preceded the physical violence. The missing keys, for instance. Andreas Gruber, a man who trusted no one, had been deeply disturbed by their disappearance and reappearance. He suspected a prank, or perhaps a local thief. But in hindsight, it was the first tangible sign that someone had gained access to their home, someone who knew their habits, their routines, their vulnerabilities. The keys were taken, copied, and then returned, a silent declaration of intent. The killer was already inside, metaphorically, if not yet physically, within their walls. Then there were the footsteps in the attic. The previous maid had been driven away by them, convinced the farm was haunted. The Grubers themselves had heard them, the creak of floorboards above their sleeping heads, the rustle of straw. Andreas, armed with his rifle, had searched the attic multiple times, always finding it empty. But what if the killer was simply hiding, pressed against the rafters, holding their breath, waiting for Andreas to leave? The attic, a dark, dusty space filled with forgotten things, became a silent observation post, a vantage point from which the unseen guest could watch, learn, and plan. The newspaper from Munich, found on the farm, was another unsettling clue. It was a city paper, not something a rural farmer would typically read. It suggested an outside presence, someone who had traveled, someone who was perhaps more sophisticated than a local vagrant. It was a deliberate, almost taunting gesture, a subtle hint of the killer's presence, daring the Grubers to notice, to react. But they didn't. They dismissed it as another oddity, another inexplicable event in a series of strange occurrences. The most chilling aspect of this pre-murder period was the killer's apparent residency on the farm before the murders. The footprints in the snow, leading to the house but not away, suggested that the intruder had arrived, perhaps days earlier, and simply never left. The noises in the attic, the missing keys, the newspaper, all pointed to a continuous, unseen presence. The killer was living among them, in their own home, a silent shadow moving through their lives, observing their every move, learning their patterns, waiting for the opportune moment. Imagine the psychological torment, to know or to suspect that someone is in your house, but to be unable to find them, to hear noises in the dead of night, to see inexplicable signs, to feel a pervasive sense of dread, yet to have no concrete evidence. The Grubers were isolated, not just geographically, but socially. Their strained relationships with the villagers meant they had no one to turn to, no one to confide in, no one to truly believe their increasingly bizarre tales. Their paranoia, once dismissed as an eccentricity, was in fact a terrifyingly accurate premonition. The killer, whoever they were, was patient. They didn't strike immediately. They observed. They learned. They waited for the perfect moment. This patience, this cold calculation, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire crime. It wasn't a crime of passion, but a meticulously planned act of brutality. The arrival of the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, on the afternoon of March 31st, was the final, tragic piece of the puzzle. She was an innocent, unaware of the darkness that had already enveloped the farm. Her presence, a new variable, might have been the catalyst. Perhaps the killer, having observed and waited, decided that her arrival marked the end of their patience, the moment to act before another witness could complicate their plans. The details of the murders themselves, pieced together by the police, suggested a swift, brutal efficiency. The victims were lured, one by one, into the barn, where they were struck down with a pickaxe. First Andreas, then Kazilia, then Victoria, and then young Kazilia. The maid, Maria, was killed in her bed, and finally, little Joseph in his cradle. The sequence suggested a deliberate, methodical approach, designed to eliminate each member of the family without raising an alarm. The most disturbing detail, however, was what happened after the murders. The killer remained on the farm for several days. They fed the animals, milked the cows, ate meals in the kitchen, and even lit fires in the hearth. It was as if they had simply taken over the farm, claiming it as their own. This act, so brazen, so utterly devoid of human emotion, suggested a profound psychological detachment, a chilling sense of ownership over the lives they had extinguished. This period, when the killer lived amongst the dead, was the ultimate manifestation of the unseen guest. They were no longer just a shadow in the attic. They were a physical presence, moving through the house, performing the mundane tasks of farm life, all while the bodies of their victims lay hidden in the barn. It was a grotesque parody of domesticity, a chilling testament to the killer's cold-bloodedness and audacity. The villagers, myself included, had heard the strange stories, seen the subtle signs. We had dismissed them, or perhaps we had simply chosen not to see the true horror lurking beneath the surface. The Grubers were reclusive, difficult people. It was easier to ignore their eccentricities than to confront the possibility of something truly sinister. This collective inaction, this turning of a blind eye, allowed the unseen guest to solidify their presence, to plan their horrific act, and to ultimately carry it out without intervention. The silence of Hinterkaifeck, which had always been profound, was now a hollow, echoing void, filled with the ghosts of the murdered and the chilling presence of a killer who had walked among them, unseen, unheard, until it was too late. The true horror was not just the violence, but the insidious, patient infiltration, the slow, terrifying realization that evil had taken root in their very home, nourished by their isolation and the villagers' indifference. The morning of April 4th, 1922, dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the horror that was about to unfold. 3 days had passed since Hans, the postman, had last seen any sign of life at Hinterkaifeck. 3 days of an unnatural silence that had gnawed at the edges of my mind. The mail, undelivered, had piled up in my satchel, a silent accusation. My unease had grown into a gnawing certainty that something was terribly wrong. I had spoken to Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a local farmer who had a business arrangement with Andreas Gruber. He too had noticed the strange silence. Gruber hadn't shown up for a scheduled meeting, and his cattle, usually visible in the pastures, were nowhere to be seen. The lack of smoke from the chimney, the absence of any movement on the farm, it was all too unsettling. Together, Lorenz, his son, and I decided to make a proper investigation. We walked the familiar path to Hinterkaifeck, the silence amplifying with every step. The air was still, heavy, as if holding its breath. The farm buildings, usually bustling with the sounds of daily life, stood like silent sentinels, their dark timbers absorbing the weak morning light. We approached the farmhouse cautiously. The stable door, which I had noticed ajar days before, was still open, flapping gently in the breeze. A chill ran down my spine. This was not Andreas Gruber's way. He was a man obsessed with order, with security. Lorenz, a more direct man than I, pushed open the stable door. The smell hit us first, a thick, cloying, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. It was the same faint smell I had detected days ago, but now it was overpowering, unmistakable. The smell of death. Then we saw them. They lay in the barn, piled haphazardly, as if discarded. Andreas Gruber, his face contorted in a silent scream, his head brutally caved in. Beside him, his wife Kazilia, in a similar state. Then Victoria Gabriel, her eyes wide with terror, and her daughter, young Kazilia, her small body crumpled beside her mother. They were covered in straw, as if someone had tried to hide them, but the attempt was clumsy, incomplete. A collective gasp escaped us. The sight was beyond comprehension, a tableau of unimaginable brutality. My mind reeled, struggling to process the horror. It was like a scene from a nightmare, but the smell, the cold reality of the bodies, rooted it firmly in the waking world. We stumbled out of the barn, gasping for fresh air, our faces pale with shock. Lorenz, his voice trembling, managed to articulate the unspeakable. They're dead. All of them. Murdered. We quickly searched the rest of the farm. Inside the farmhouse, the horror continued. In her bed, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, lay dead, also killed by blows to the head. And then, the most heartbreaking discovery of all, little Joseph, the 2-year-old, in his cradle, brutally murdered. His tiny, innocent face still, his small body lifeless. 6 people. 6 lives extinguished in the most brutal fashion. The silence that had hung over Hinterkaifeck for days was now explained, but the explanation was more terrifying than any uncertainty. The news spread like wildfire through the small village. Disbelief, then horror, then a pervasive fear. Who could have done such a thing? And why? The villagers, who had largely kept their distance from the Grubers, were now gripped by a collective terror. A monster walked among them, or had walked among them, and no one had known. The police investigation began swiftly, but it was hampered from the outset. The crime scene, already disturbed by myself and the others, was further compromised by the influx of curious villagers and investigators who, in their shock and inexperience, inadvertently destroyed crucial evidence. There were no clear protocols for crime scene preservation in such a remote, rural area in 1922. The farm became a chaotic hub of activity, with footprints trampling over potential clues and objects being moved without proper documentation. The initial police theory focused on robbery. Andreas Gruber was known to keep large sums of money on the farm, but while some money was indeed missing, it didn't seem to be the primary motive. The brutality of the murders, the methodical nature of the killings, and the fact that the killer had remained on the farm for days after the crime, feeding the animals, suggested something far more complex than a simple robbery. The weapon, a pickaxe, was found on the farm. It belonged to the Grubers. This suggested that the killer was either someone familiar with the farm, or someone who had gained access to it and used what was readily available. interviews with villagers yielded little. Everyone had a theory, a suspicion, but no concrete evidence. The old rumors about Andreas Gruber's incestuous relationship with Victoria resurfaced, leading to speculation about a crime of passion or revenge, but again, no proof. The previous made stories of ghosts and noises in the attic were suddenly reevaluated, now seen as chilling premonitions rather than mere superstition. The police brought in detectives from Munich, but even their expertise struggled against the lack of clear leads. The killer had left no discernible footprints, no clear path of entry or exit, beyond the initial, baffling tracks in the snow. They had vanished as silently as they had appeared. The investigation stumbled. Suspects were questioned, but released. Theories were proposed, debated, and then discarded. The initial frenzy of activity slowly faded, replaced by a grim resignation. The case went cold. No one was ever charged. The mystery of Hinterkaifeck remained unsolved, a dark stain on the quiet Bavarian countryside. For me, Hans, the discovery was a turning point. The world no longer felt safe, predictable. The ordinary could conceal the monstrous. The silence of the farm, which had once seemed merely isolated, now felt like a profound, echoing void, a testament to the fact that evil could exist and flourish without a trace, without a name. The day after silence had brought not answers, but only a deeper, more terrifying question. Who could have done such a thing? And why had they vanished so completely? The police investigation had stumbled and faded, but the chilling memory of that day and the unanswered questions would forever haunt the quiet village of Kaifeck. The decades have passed since that terrible spring of 1922, and I, Hans, am an old man now. My steps are slower, my memory sometimes falters, but the images of Hinterkaifeck and the hollow silence that descended upon it remain as vivid as if it were yesterday. The farm itself was eventually demolished, its stones scattered, its soil tilled, as if to erase the very memory of the horror it had witnessed. But evil, I have learned, does not simply leave a place. It lingers, it hides, and sometimes it whispers from the attic of memory, even when the physical structure is gone. The Hinterkaifeck murders became a local legend, a chilling folktale whispered around hearths on long winter nights. The details, though gruesome, were often embellished, distorted by time and the human need to make sense of the senseless. But the core truth remained: 6 people, brutally murdered, and a killer who vanished without a trace. The official investigation, though never closed, eventually faded into obscurity. The files grew dusty, the detectives moved on, and the case became a cold, hard knot in the annals of Bavarian crime. Over the years, countless theories have been proposed. Some pointed to local grudges, to the Gruber family's reputation for bitterness and their rumored secrets. The incestuous relationship between Andreas and Victoria, though never proven, remained a persistent, unsettling undercurrent in the local lore, suggesting a crime of passion or revenge from within or close to the family. Other theories focused on robbery, despite the limited amount of money missing. Some suggested a vagrant, a transient passing through the area, who stumbled upon the farm and committed the horrific act. But the meticulousness of the killer's actions, the feeding of the animals, the lighting of fires, seemed to contradict the impulsive nature of a typical vagrant. The most unsettling theory, and the one that has always resonated most deeply with me, is that the killer was someone known to the family, someone who had infiltrated their lives and then, in a cold, calculated manner, eliminated them. The missing keys, the footprints, the noises in the attic, these were not the actions of a random intruder. They were the actions of someone who had a profound knowledge of the farm, of the family's habits, and who had spent time observing, planning, waiting. The idea that the killer had lived among them, unseen, for days before the murders, remains the most chilling possibility. I often wonder about the psychological impact on the killer. To commit such an act, to live among the dead for days, to perform mundane tasks while surrounded by the bodies of your victims, it speaks of a profound detachment, a chilling absence of conscience. Was it a local, someone who returned to their normal life, carrying the weight of such a monstrous secret? Or was it someone who simply vanished, disappearing into the vastness of the world, never to be heard from again? The anonymity of the killer is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. The village of Kafek, too, carried the scars of Hinterkaifeck. A quiet fear settled over the community, a pervasive sense of unease that never truly dissipated. Doors were locked more tightly, suspicions lingered, and the once open trust between neighbors was subtly eroded. The knowledge that such evil could exist so close, in such an ordinary setting, shattered the illusion of rural innocence. For me, the memories are like ghosts in the attic of my mind. They stir in the quiet hours of the night, when the wind howls outside and the old house creaks. I remember the silence of the farm, the sickly sweet smell, the faces of the dead. I remember the fear, the confusion, and the overwhelming sense of wrongness. I often sit by my window, looking out at the fields that once led to Hinterkaifeck, now just a distant, indistinct landscape. I wonder if evil ever truly leaves a place, or if it just hides, like a shadow, waiting for the memory to fade, for the story to be forgotten before it stirs again. The farm is gone, but the ground beneath it remembers. The trees that once sheltered it remember. And I, the old postman, I remember. The case of Hinterkaifeck is a testament to the enduring power of the unsolved. It defies logic, resists explanation, and continues to haunt those who delve into its dark depths. It is a story of superstition and silence, of shadows that stretch across generations, reminding us that some mysteries are never meant to be solved, some questions never answered. The silence that followed the murders was not a silence of peace, but a profound, hollow quiet, filled with the echoes of unanswered screams. And in that silence, I, Hans, the silent witness, often hear the whispers of the unseen guest, a chilling reminder that even in the most remote and seemingly peaceful corners of the world, darkness can take root and leave behind a legacy of terror that time can never truly erase. The ghosts of Hinterkaifeck, I believe, still linger, not in the physical attic of a demolished farmhouse, but in the collective memory of a village, and in the quiet, reflective mind of an old postman who once walked that long, silent path. And now, the stories fade into the night. You've just listened to three of the strangest, quietest, and most haunting true crime cases, each still echoing with unanswered questions. Some crimes leave behind evidence. Others leave behind emptiness. But in the soft telling of these tales, we find something else, a stillness. A moment to reflect. A sense of peace, even in the unknown. If you're still awake, thank you for spending your time with us. And if you've already drifted off, then these words are just a whisper on your dreams. There are always more mysteries to explore quietly, gently, one step at a time. Until next time, sleep well. And may your night be calm, even when the stories are not. Good night.